No English Bible falls just into one category there of our two kinds of translation, just a word for word or a thought for thought, because translating is a difficult thing. And the subject matter, what we're talking about, will also affect how we translate things. Can we translate them literally, or do we have to translate them in some sort of thought for thought or understanding? Now, one of the ways that comes through that's most evident and easy to explain, keeping in mind that this is just one example. There are hundreds of examples not related to this, but of the same vein, where if we translate the word literally, it's not going to communicate. But if we translate it thought for thought, then we're getting into some interpretation before we've even translated it. Now, this example would be the male reproductive organ. Yes, the Bible does talk about the male reproductive organ. It also talks about the female reproductive system and cycle and so forth. And that brings up a good question. How do we talk about that in polite society? Well, we do have proper names in English for body parts and for cycles and for things of that nature. We also have slang terms. Slang terms are often kind of, descriptive, but a bit coarse, and you don't really use that kind of language in polite society. And in those cases, we often have euphemism. Euphemism would be a way to say it in a more polite kind of way. The Bible is the same, as in the Hebrew text never actually uses the Hebrew word for the male reproductive organ. There you see the Hebrew word for flesh. That word is not the Hebrew word for the male organ. Now, in a text like Genesis chapter 17, verse 11, here Abram is getting his name changed. He's entering the Abrahamic covenant. And of course, the sign of the Abrahamic covenant is circumcision. Genesis chapter 17, verse 11 in the NIV, you shall circumcise yourself in the flesh of your foreskin. The word flesh there is the Hebrew word for flesh. That same Hebrew word is the exact same word used in Exodus chapter 12, verse 8. There, God is talking to Moses about the Passover lamb, and they shall eat the flesh of the Passover lamb. And the word there is flesh. It's not the male organ. And so, the text uses metaphor. Now, in this case, because of the context, you can see when you look at the various translations. The NIV, you shall undergo, I made a mistake earlier. That was not the NIV that I originally said was. Here, the NIV, you will undergo circumcision. The New Living Translation, you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. The New American Standard Bible, which is a very literal word for word, you shall be circumcised in the flesh. So here, the word flesh in Hebrew, because of the context, because it talks about circumcision and because it talks about foreskin, the translation doesn't need to really change. Flesh is a good translation there in that the idea is communicated. Nobody looks at that with circumcision and with foreskin mentioned and ponders, what would flesh be? We all know what it would be. However, there's another example in the Bible, this in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 11, referring to the male reproductive organ. And there you see the Hebrew word, and its literal translation would be that which excites shame. This is the passage where if two men are fighting and one of the wives of one of the men come and help her husband by seizing the other man by his that which excites shame. Well, now that's not a very good translation. It's not that we couldn't figure it out. It's just that's kind of an awkward way to say it. That's not really going to help in, cutting through the awkwardness of saying it in public, reading it, for example, in church or in Bible study or so forth. How do the Bible translations deal with it? Well, you can see the NIV translates it, seizes him by his private parts. The NASB, the word-for-word translation, translates it as genitals. And that brings up a good conversation, and that is, how do we translate in a way that communicates the original and is readable in church? You can't be terribly cross with your translation in church, knowing that you'll have a wide variety of ages, a wide variety of social experience, a wide variety of what is proper and what is not proper represented in churches. And how do you translate these rather sensitive words, not just when it relates to the male organ, but when it relates to basically anything when it comes to the body? There we really do have to ask, is there a metaphorical, is there a euphemistic way, euphemism kind of way to translate it, that we can communicate what is going on, but we can say it in such a way that it's not going to be terribly offensive? Now, one challenge to this would be some places where we're pretty sure that euphemism is going on. We're pretty sure that they're saying something there. It's not explicit. And the same way that we have ways of saying things in our language, not unlike other things that we've talked about in English, where a native English speaker will know that if you say this phrase, you'll know what it means. And nobody will need to help you understand it. Whereas a non-native English speaker may hear that phrase and may not understand what it was that was just said. One example of this, when I was teaching a class in Oregon once, we had a large crowd of people in the room, and we were talking about how Christians read the Bible, understand the Bible, and why it's important to interpret as you're going along. Most of the audience, in fact, whatever, 99% of the audience was native English speakers. One lady was not a native English speaker. She was born and raised in Germany. She spoke German. And so we got to a particular passage, and I was talking about how you have to read things in context. In Acts chapter 15, the church decides that circumcision is no longer going to be required, or excuse me, I should say, it is not required for Gentiles who want to come to Christ. It's not. But chapter 16, then, Paul goes ahead and circumcises Timothy. And you would think, wait a minute, on the surface here, it seems like there could be a contradiction. The church just decided Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. However, in this chapter, Paul is going on to circumcise him. And there you have to read into who Timothy is and why circumcision would be beneficial for him, whereas later Paul will talk about in his letters that other Gentiles were not circumcised and were not compelled to be circumcised. At that point in our discussion, I said I wanted to find a way to make an appropriate circumcision joke at this time, but I thought that would be a little off the topic. And I got the reaction, because my slip there was intentional, I got the reaction from every English speaker in the room that I wanted. They were all laughing. Now the German lady looked at everybody like, why are you laughing? I loved it because the husband then, who was a native English speaker born in America, looked at her and said, German, German, German. That is, he said something to her in German. And she responded, ja. And he continued, German, German, German. Ja, German, 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 German. Oh, she started to laugh. She got the joke. One passage that we're almost certain there is euphemism going on in the passage comes to us from 1 Kings chapter 20. You can see that the same passage is in 2 Chronicles chapter 10 verse 14. Here Rehoboam is talking to the people who represent the tribes. The tribes are saying that when Solomon was king, he put heavy burdens on us, lighten our burdens and we'll serve you. Rehoboam gives him their answer, and in his answer he says, now I tell you, this is from the NIV, now I tell you, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. In the English Standard Version, it's translated, my father's thigh. In the New American Standard Bible, it's translated, my father's loins. Yes. The answer is yes. He is probably insulting his father's manhood in a way that no man wants to be insulted. He is saying, Rehoboam is saying that my little finger is bigger than my father's male part. How do you translate that in such a way that communicates that that's the boast he's making, and you can read it in church? Well, there you see how the NIV, the English Standard, and the New American Standard translate it, where it gives you a little bit of a hint. I mean, anybody reading that goes, I bet he's talking about, yep, he probably is, you know. So there you can see how it is possible to communicate what is probably euphemism without actually using euphemism, and so forth. And with that, I think that wraps up why we see so many differences as people have tried to translate. There is a little bit of a science to translation. There's also a little bit of art in translating. How do we take this concept and how do we communicate it in such a way that the English reader will understand what's going on? I'll give you an example from my own experience. Just recently, Dave emailed me. He emailed me to tell my wife that Linda would be covering children's church. When I was replying to my wife, then very quickly, I wrote very quickly, Linda is going to take care of the kids this Sunday. Now, did I say exactly what David said? No, I didn't. Did I communicate what David was communicating? I absolutely did. And my wife knew when she read it, she knew who Linda was. She knew what take care of the kids on Sunday means. And therefore, that translation, although I used different words, it was understood. And that's what's going on when people are translating. They're translating it in a way that they want you to grasp. They want you to understand what the ancient source said, but they want to say it in a way that the modern English speaker will be able to grasp, will be able to understand. It's not going to be a mystery to them. I like the time that Babylon Bee, the online satirical website, said that pastor with the King James Version had to do a deep word study of ancient English. And that is so true when it comes to various things. Keeping in mind that I'm a student of the New American Standard. I've actually read the American Standard, and I'm a fan of the New American Standard. Why? Because it took what the American Standard had already done, and it modified it. One, with more documents, that is the manuscripts that have been found, and the information that we have now on what is more likely to be the original reading than a variant reading. Two, it's also concerned with putting it in language that you and I speak. Language that you and I communicate in, and we just know right away what words mean, what a sentence means, and therefore. With that, we're going to wrap it up, and next we're going to do the problem of evil. Hey guys, Ozzy here. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful.